Welcome to the 2021 Nils Klim Conversation. Hi, Daria.
Hello.
Congratulations on the award.
Thank you.
So the Nils Klim Award is given to a young scholar under the age of 35 from a Nordic country for outstanding contributions to research in humanities, social sciences, law or theology. And the Nils Klim Committee has stated that you are an exceptionally accomplished young scholar who has carried out innovative and cross-disciplinary research in the intersection between political science, environmental studies, and digital humanities. So, for you, Daria, what is the significance of winning an award like this?
First of all, it is, of course, a great honor and a privilege to be awarded this very important prize. And on a very personal level, of course, it just feels great to know that somebody, and not just somebody, but a very renowned committee made of scholars and academics has taken notice of your work and thinks that what you're doing is valuable. And I think as social scientists, we are all, actually we start this profession, we go and do this research because we want to make a difference. You know, because we think that we could have something valuable to say and maybe do something in this world, some positive change. And for me, receiving this prize, because what is in the background of my research is the search for transformative positive change. So receiving this prize means that I may have already found something and that I'm just on a good trajectory to do more, to give more to the world that would, to a certain extent, maybe make our life a little bit better. And this definitely is a great feeling.
So, as the committee noted in its statement, your work spans quite broadly. You're quite interdisciplinary. You draw on different fields: political science, digital humanities, Arctic and Russian studies. You've worked on maritime transportation, and you're interested in using big data, which is quite an interesting mix of approaches. So what's your driving force in this? What has motivated you and inspired you to draw these different approaches together?
My research has always been phenomenon and problem oriented. So in a way, the fact that all these things got drawn together is not because I was sitting in my room and thinking, what else could I draw into this mix and how could I make it all, a bit more exotic? But it's rather that I had something in mind, some question that I really wanted to answer. And then I just started trying out different things. What could work? And then when I realized, this doesn't work, but maybe I could try it, with a different type of data. Maybe I could try to invoke this methodology. Maybe if I go through another context, then it would open up something. And so in a way, I was just, taken into different directions, and these things all got on board because I had something very specific in mind. And it all started for me with a question of global maritime transportation. Very interested in shipping, still I am, because I think it's a fascinating and quite overlooked domain to study and to understand and to draw parallels with. And I must tell you that when I remember in the first year of my PhD, when I came to one summer school in environmental governance, and I started talking about my case of shipping, a couple of professors told me, that's very interesting things that you are thinking about, but why shipping? Nobody does shipping. Choose some other case. And that felt to me like, no, you didn't understand. I'm actually interested in shipping in the first place. I think this is where my fascination, this is why I want to do this research. And now I'm going to find my way to, what are the theories I need, what are the tools I need, what are the methods I need to open up this specific story.
It seems to me that that if the old professors are encouraging you to do something else, you're really on the right track. Isn't that true? So tell us about your path towards the topics that we've been discussing here. We had the Nils Klim seminar the other day, where we had Victor Galas and Marianne Ryghaug, part of a conversation on aligning digitalization and sustainability. So how does your work and what you've been building up sort of feed into that larger question of how to align digitalization and sustainability?
So at the core of my work initially has always been one question, independent of what I was doing research on. Was it about renewable energy in the Russian Arctic, or global shipping, or some transport infrastructure? The question that was driving me was, how does environmental governance work in situations when there is no central authority that takes care of coordination and control? This has been always the driving question of my research. And by environmental governance, I mean getting things done towards certain environmental objectives. So when I think of governance, what I think of is a process, first of all. This process is directional. There is some kind of a goal. We want to solve some problem, or we want to open up some opportunity. We want to enable something. So there is a direction, and it's always multi-actor. And it revolves around sub-problems of communal importance. So in a way, governance is about solving collective action problems and creating opportunities for collective action. And when we add the environmental in front of governance, it places this process into a certain domain, into a subject matter of the relationship between humans and our living sphere, the environment in which we are finding ourselves. My interest towards environment is probably not very surprising. I'm coming from the generation that grew up very much in this narrative. First it was the ozone layer, and then we had some acid rains, and then the global warming started that turned out to be a massive climate change. So the narrative that something is not quite well with our living environment and we're not quite sure where we are all going is something that I grew up with. Obviously, I'm coming from a generation before the Fridays for Future generation, for whom climate emergency is really already something of a more existential, and they even don't know, was there anything before that, right? So they kind of grew up with this. But I've seen a number of different global problems already, but they all somehow relate to the question of how can humans survive and thrive on this limited planet within the planetary boundaries. And this is where my interest towards environment came from.
You point to a very, very important part of the problem. And in my own research, I focus on sustainability and particularly the climate change problem. And we're really faced with, as you say, with problems where there are no it's not a very easy hierarchy or very easy set of responsibilities divided between clearly defined actors. The landscape of governance is rather complex. It's transboundary, and it's hard to kind of identify who's responsible for each of these different problems and what solutions will work, etc. So I think it's a fascinating research field, and I know you've been using, among other approaches, concepts from environmental governance to try to address this. How would you say research approaches within environmental governance in that field can help us understand these issues.
Yes, so when I was studying maritime shipping, which I think is a wonderful case of, it's a transboundary, multi-stakeholder industry. The ships are somewhere on the global oceans. We can't really police them. We can only know what they're doing once they are in ports. They are the blood of our economies because they're transporting goods. They're not out there because they're just having fun. It's not recreational shipping. They're transporting goods from A to B. They are running our whole economy. All the raw materials and finished goods, everything is being transported. At the same time, we don't know anything about it. It just appears that things are just there, when you go to a store, without giving any thought that 9 out of 10 objects that you see around you have been in some either as raw material or as a finished good on board of a ship. It's just crazy to think about this, but this is true. And when I was thinking about shipping, I was thinking, what can I compare it to? And funnily enough, I felt like the internet and shipping somehow conceptually have certain similarities in terms of, what kind of a governance problem this domain or what set of governance problems this domain presents to us. And now with the unfolding discourses on digitalization and right now our understanding that the way how we use digital technologies is often harmful. We use rare resources. We need a lot of energy to run the virtual worlds. I realized that actually the comparison works also in the other way around. It's not only that shipping is like the virtual worlds or like the internet, but the internet is also a bit like shipping. So this is when it occurred to me that maybe now it's we can use also some expertise accumulated in transboundary environmental governance and global environmental governance to look at the digital domain.
So you in the Nils Klim seminar you quoted a report from the United Nations, the Digital Transformation Report 2018, which says digital technologies are rapidly transforming society, but the mechanisms for cooperation and governance of this landscape have failed to keep pace, which is what we're talking about now, in a sense. So what are the ways forward here? I mean, what are the sort of the seeds to solutions that you identify? We also touched on the SDG goals, for example, in climate change. In the climate change domain, we have the Paris Agreement. So there are attempts to try to govern these transboundary problems. Do you think that these sorts of global solutions are a way forward? Are they the way forward, or are there sort of blind spots also in the way that these are implemented?
This is a wonderful question. Here I would actually like to go a bit more in detail, both in terms of report and in terms of global solutions and how to approach these things. So let me start. When was it? I think it was 2017. In 2017, there was a bit of a dispute between the Secretary General of the IMO, International Maritime Organization, and the EU Commission. And they exchanged a number of quite heated letters, and they were all publicly available, where the IMO was basically saying that the EU, the fact that they're including shipping emissions into the EU emission trading schemes is going to undermine the global governance, and it's going to create a huge problem for governing greenhouse gas emissions from shipping. And the EU should not do this effort, and it would be too regional, and it would create somehow differences in the global system. It would abandon the level playing field. It's not a good thing. And the EU was responding to them and saying, no, we're just doing what we're supposed to do under the Paris Agreement. Look, we are doing the right thing. And you're very welcome to maybe move a bit faster with your solution, and we are very willing to align with you, but as long as there is nothing on the global level, we are very willing to do this. And then the stakeholders, in the maritime community, they were also very divided. Some of them said, we are on the side of the IMO, this is the correct way of seeing the problem. And then some were more on the side of the EU and some other coalitions, like Coalition for Sustainable Shipping. Why am I telling this? And I actually wrote a paper on this as well that has been published in Marine Policy. Because basically this discussion illustrates perfectly one very old-standing discussion in political science, and that is the debate on polycentric governance. I draw a lot of inspiration for my work from Elinor Ostrom and her scholarship. This is my big, ideal of how she has been doing research. We can talk about it in more detail later. Why I think, her scholarship, but not only the intellectual scholarship, but also the ways how she was doing research and how she was approaching the task is just absolutely outstanding, and is something that, at least I really want to, I'm looking up on her and her example. Anyways, back to the polycentric governance. So this is the long-standing belief that we should have some kind of a global architecture, and this is what solves the problem. And this is where Elinor Ostrom, with multiple studies, very, very well argued and empirically proven, showed that this is just not correct. We need different scales, and governance can happen simultaneously at different scales. And even if some solutions are overlapping, this is actually not a problem. And there are two main reasons for why polycentric governance is very strong. So number one, it allows experimentation. Number two, it allows policy learning. And we have seen this in shipping domain, for example. We have seen experimentation. So let's say with the sulfur emissions, at the beginning, Swedish ports had some differentiated dues, and then in Norway there was a certain tax, and then there was an attempt to create some kind of a protected area. And this is how we little by little arrived at what works, what doesn't work so well. Because if there are different policies in place, we can learn, we can compare. If we all follow the same path, then we will never know what the alternative pathways would have brought. So in a way, there is room then for experimentation and for learning. Then we can also scale down the very basic, democratic principle of subsidiarity, that we try to solve the problem as close to the problem as only possible. And very important, we can account for the context. And context may mean here the regional or the geographic spatial context, or maybe the industry context, the sectoral context, cultural context. There are so many contexts, and solutions are not just simply transferable from one context into another. And this we have also seen in shipping. And this policy learning has happened. The sulfur emission control areas have become kind of the golden standard of what to do with sulfur emissions. Then we have seen proliferation of such areas. We see much better outcomes now on sulfur because we have learned, we have figured out what works. Now, if we look into this report that I was quoting into the seminar, there were proposed 3 architectures, possible architectures for global digital governance. And one of them was about strengthening the existing Internet Governance Forum, and the 2 others were more on the kind of using the networks that already exist and maybe building like a network of networks. And one of them more was on the side of polycentricity and the commons. And then, so this special group, they have provided this report. They provided 3 types of architectures, and they said, well, maybe the stakeholders could consider. Well, when the UN considered them, they said, well, interesting solutions, maybe we go for the first one, which is basically, Internet Governance Forum plus we should strengthen this organization. This is a very UN solution. And I don't have anything against the United Nations. It's a great organization. It's a very important organization. But I think that the narrative of polycentricity did not yet quite arrive there. And maybe it's now our job as scientists to bring more examples of transformative change also in this domain to show that polycentricity is one very concrete example or approach to governance that we have experimented with in the environmental domain, seems to bring outcomes. Maybe we should consider it also in the digital domain.
I totally agree with you that polycentricity is a very good approach, and I mean, as a geographer, I particularly like how you can then contextualize solutions to different areas and to different domains, which I think is very, very important. But at the same time, I think within sustainability and within climate change, I sometimes also wonder, does it provide a strong enough direction? So when you look at climate change, for example, we need a very rapid downturn in CO2 emissions. And I wonder if polycentricity provides a strong enough architecture to really achieve that. What are your thoughts on this?
Of course, it's difficult to say just like this, but from my understanding is, let's take one concrete example and then roll it from there. So I have done some research on uptake of renewable energy in the Russian Arctic. So we have just taken all the renewable energy facilities in the Russian Arctic, about 100 of them, and then we did some statistical analysis of those, tried to figure out what are the pathways leading to uptake of renewables, and then we actually ended up with 4 different groups of communities. So we grouped the communities, all the communities that have now renewable energy installed, into 4 different groups, and their pathway to renewables uptake is different. And it depends on how well the community is accessible, what are their current resources, what is their political administrative situation and economic situation in this community, and so many other things. What is the outlook, the demographic outlook? Is it a community with inward or outward migration? So even if we take something that seems to be very homogeneous, Russian Arctic, already there we can see a lot of diversity. And in a way, the polycentric approach would mean that we can have different ways of achieving the same goal. So in a way, this is where we could go back to, goal setting such as Sustainable Development Goals and as Paris Agreement. And I think Paris Agreement, in a way, in its very basis, has a bit of this polycentricity interwoven, because it's not telling us how to get there. And it does call for, to a certain extent, for experimentation, but it does provide us, a very clear baseline. We can debate if this is a useful one, but, I think it's still quite a major achievement to have so many nations signing on to this. Same with the Sustainable Development Goals.
I absolutely agree, and the Paris Agreement is certainly a polycentric architecture, and we may even think that's why it was achieved, because that's why countries were able to sign on to it, or that we managed to get some countries to sign on to it, because it has this polycentric architecture, and it leaves room for countries to follow their own approaches to cutting CO2 emissions. And so we have that agreement. Whether or not, maybe we could see the Paris Agreement as sort of a test case for if polycentric governance works or not. Who knows? So I'd like to shift us more towards technology and digitalization, which I understand is a field you're kind of moving your research into. And we had a long conversation about this at the Nils Klim seminar, again with Victor Galas and Marianne Ryghaug. So you wrote a paper recently on algorithmic governance, which I thought was a fascinating framing. Would you explain this term, algorithmic governance, and what's its significance?
Right. So I guess in our field, in policy and governance scholars, or public policy scholars, which is a kind of a small subset of political scientists, there has been now a debate, quite a heated debate for maybe around 5 years. Is there algorithmic governance or not? Can we say that something like this already exists? And by algorithmic governance here is meant governance, and now you can draw back to the definition that I was giving before, that is made by algorithms. So before we said governance is solving collective action problems, directional, multi-stakeholder, and now wait, what? By algorithms. So it's not even people who now take part in this governance, but there are some programs, computer programs, some decision-making rules called algorithms that are now installed and participate in solving issues of communal importance. Is it so or not? And in order to look into this with my colleague from Sheffield, Matt Wood, we looked into different cases, very traditional cases of governance, hierarchical governance, market governance, and co-governance. And we saw how these forms of governance got some algorithms involved. And then we asked ourselves, what has changed? What is going on here, right? And we, interestingly enough, observed certain convergence between these different types of governance. So in a way, our argument would be that these types of governance that were very distinct before, hierarchical, more of a top-down, and then co-governance, more maybe of a bottom-up and relying on networks, and market governance, they get some characteristics of similarity once algorithms are installed into them, which basically means that maybe we do not have yet the fully fledged algorithmic governance in the public sphere, but we are definitely moving our governance in that direction, which poses very severe questions about legitimacy, accountability, and democratic quality of such procedures.
Precisely, and that was my question with it, and part of what made me so fascinated by this framing, by this approach. I mean, to me, governance. One critical aspect of it is its sort of democratic legitimacy, and it should come from the voters, from the people. But then, if governance becomes more and more algorithmic, to what extent do we control it? To what extent do we have the necessary understanding of it in order to control it? So it seems to me that this introduces a whole new set of very interesting, but also potentially problematic democratic questions.
It definitely does. I would, however, disagree with you there. I think that democratic governance is a special subset of governance, because as a scholar of Russia and Eurasia, we also do speak of governance in authoritarian and non-democratic contexts. And it is also a very similar thing, but it does not have the democratic element, or the democratic element is very misfigurated, or how would you say this? So in a way, this is where we could ask where to position algorithmic governance on this continuum between democracy and autocracy. And we should never forget that algorithms are still products of humans. There are some people who create them. There are some people who decide which kind of rules going to be ingrained in them. Even when we are talking machine learning, machine learning is still happening post factum. So first we give some data, then the algorithm is going through it, then it makes advancements. And actually it's our decision that the algorithm is going to learn. Of course, we cannot control it, and there are certain these black box aspects. But at the end of the day, whether we are now going to use algorithms to solve certain legal cases or to decide on benefit allocation is our decision.
I think that's an excellent point, and you also made this point very strongly in the Nils Klim seminar. I mean, but we do tend to forget this, and I think we tend to see that these machines, these algorithms, are kind of just suddenly appear in a way, and that they are uncontrollable. And I think if we forget that point that you're just making, that they are, in the first place created by humans, by actors who with a certain intentionality, then that's a self-fulfilling prophecy, and we just sort of let them, we forget the fact that they can be controlled. But I wonder, at the moment, in this sort of global or international public discourse on digitalization and where we're heading, there's a lot of pessimism, I would say, particularly linked to democracy. I mean, it's linked to, I know this is not your concrete research area, but what we've seen in the past couple of years, rise of populism, not just the past couple of years, but a bit further than that. Fake news, the allegations of, the Russian interference into U.S. politics and maybe other countries. So we're seeing, I think, more and more of the dark sides of this technology. Isn't this also an example of how we're struggling to control this technology?
Yeah, well, 2 points on that. Number one, Langdon Winner, one of the founding fathers of science and technology studies, one of his first major books was called Technology Out of Control, right? And basically he was making this argument. It's a brilliant book. It's quite a long one, quite a thick book, that actually takes a spanning view from very early times of technology and really going very deeply into history and showing us how this is something very human, this narrative about technology out of control. And the Frankenstein metaphor and this kind of trope is just there. It has been there and it is still there. And yet it has a lot to do with technological determinism, with this somehow belief that is constantly being also perpetuated in media, in mass culture, but also to an extent in research, that somehow technology just defines our society, our culture, our values, our politics, and then we can't do anything. But as we have the understanding in scholarship of social constructionism, of the co-construction of society and technology, and how important it is that our understanding, our deployment, our stories and narratives that we create around it, then it looks quite differently. And yes, in a way, we first were all so fascinated about the possibilities that digitalization, internet, artificial intelligence, robots, you name it, will give us. Now we are very disillusioned, but we have to now just even up, it's there with us to stay. It's not a bad thing per se. And in this way, it's a bit like, let's think about nature and our changing attitudes towards nature, from nature is actually our enemy because, we need our crops, and then there is drought, and then there is flood, and now let's build irrigation systems, and let's, put protection dams. And then high modernity ideals of conquest of nature, and let's take 1920s, 30s, Soviet Union going into the Arctic, and then the wonderful plans of turning the rivers to flow the other way around. And all of this has been a proper narrative until we got to understand, hey, wait, we are a part of it. And this is where the whole sustainability thinking emerged from. With technology, we're a bit backwards. we're there where we have been, it's a still very high modernity relationship that we have with technology. And I think it's just our task also to a great extent as researchers to move the conversation a bit to a, more suitable space where we can talk about the social construction of technology, but also where we can talk about it's there, it's also a part of our living environment, so let's do something about it, and let's maybe not be all too hostile towards technology, but also think about, do we behave responsibly with technology? Is it the technology that is doing harm to us, or is it us who is doing harm to technology? I'm thinking now about a book project, and one of the maybe the kind of the juiciest controversy that I want to put into it is to say, it's not that Facebook is evil and we need to be protected from it. Facebook can also, in a way, be seen as a habitat that needs protection, because there are many people doing evil things on Facebook. What do you think about that?
What we're talking about now was very well illustrated, I think, by one of your slides during the Nils Klim seminar, where you showed the Gartner's emerging technology hype cycle, which I had not seen before, where you show, it illustrates sort of in the beginning when we have a new technology, it emerges, we have this very optimistic picture of it. We've got a peak of inflated expectations, and then our expectations drop significantly. We have what's called the disillusionment, trough of disillusionment, and then we imagine so that we can emerge in this slope of enlightenment, and it sort of flattens out. So I guess what you're saying now is that we are in the trough of disillusionment, and we need to go up to the slope of enlightenment, and which I think you may be right. I've been in my own field, again, more on climate policy and climate politics, particularly related to cities and smart cities and how we use technologies in cities to solve sustainability and climate problems. I think we may be still at the top of the peak of inflated expectations, and we may be sort of going down into the disillusionment very soon. But I agree with you when it comes to Facebook and to these sort of social media are mediated relationships type of technologies. We're very much in disillusionment. But how do we get to enlightenment then, and what does that mean? And how do we, as social scientists, you mentioned this, that social scientists have a role in this. How do we contribute to getting towards enlightenment?
When it comes to the role of social science and the relevance of social science in society, here my big picture on the wall is Ben Flubery, and the whole Making Social Science meta book that I read when I was starting my PhD, and I felt like very much connected to the narrative he presents. And for me, I simplified it in three really simple steps. So what do social scientists actually do? The first thing that we do is name. We name things. It's because at some point in some debates with colleagues from natural scientists, they were asking me, but you guys don't discover anything. There's nothing to discover, right? You can't just come up with something new. And I said, well, wait a second. That's not quite correct. We discover or we invent names. It's not that institutions have not been there before. It's not that polycentric governance has not been there before it was named. But we are giving names to phenomena that cannot be directly observed. This is our first very important task, because if there is no name, we can't talk about this. In order to bring things into the realm of deliberation, they need to have names. We need language. And the first task of social sciences for me is naming, is giving language, giving phenomena that are going on in the world a certain description. once we have a name for something that is going on, we can go a bit deeper and be more critical towards it. So the second thing is critique. Understanding this phenomenon in relation to the social structure and what is it doing. And the third move in this journey of a social scientist for me is giving hope. Not stopping on critique, and this is my big critique to much of the social science, saying that, okay, this all doesn't work and this is all just a huge pile of problems, dot. No, I want to move beyond it, and I want to ask, but is there anything good in the world? Are there any good examples, positive examples of transformative change? If there are, let's study them. Let's not only study negative cases, let's also study positive cases. And this is where I draw a lot of inspiration exactly from the work of Elena Ostrom, who went to find communities who were capable of managing the commons and ask herself, why are these guys actually not doing so bad? And this is the third move. And this is how we can give hope and outlook and direction. Because I do agree that our task is not direct problem solving. Because if we jump too quickly to solutions, then we probably didn't understand the problem. And we need to stay with the problem for a while, and really kind of unpacking the problems is an important function of social science. But then also this hopeful part is very important to me.
So one problem that many social scientists and others have pointed to with digitalization is this growth of these big tech companies, Facebook, Amazon, Google, and I think they've really strengthened their position now during the pandemic, which is a problem for both the distribution of resources and power in society. Do you see this as a democratic problem in this digital transformation that we're seeing?
I definitely see it as a problem related to democracy or with implications for democracy. I'm not necessarily seeing it per se as a problem of democratic institutions. What I see maybe is some I don't know if it's reluctance or if it's more of a just lack of precedent in what actually should we do with them. On the one hand, big tech is also a source of jobs and income, and there is not only bad about them, there is definitely also good sides to them, right? So how they were able to boost commerce, and the Facebook advertisement, it works in different directions, and for some merchandisers it's actually very important to use these channels. So in a way, there are definitely probably the states at the beginning, they weren't quite sure where it's going to go. Well, nobody knew where the whole thing is going, and it seemed that there were also a lot of positive economic effects. So maybe not trying to just strangle innovation at the root. And then when we realized that there are also many adverse consequences, now questions have arisen, like what are we going to do with them? And definitely the European Union has been one of the first movers, with the GDPR, and going more on the side of data protection, and maybe going more after consumers and our individual rights, right? So some people are also a bit skeptical about it and say that the only thing that it brought is that now we also have to click a lot of accept cookies, but in a way that's definitely a great step, just the message that has been sent by GDPR. But extending my thinking about the transfer of practices from environmental domain to the digital domain, one example would be, or one thing one thing to think about would be the oil and gas sector, because the oil and gas sector, it has in a way a very similar history. At the beginning it seemed to be all great, and and now we have oil and gas, and we can power new industries, and then we can sell it, and the hard cash is coming back. So there are many positive things, and then we realized that, oh wow, this actually they turned out to be these integrated vertical corporations, and they acquire certain political stance and role, and maybe somehow have problematic implications for democracy. But then we actually turned into a regulatory ride. Right, so there has been the disintegration of these vertically integrated corporations all around the world. Maybe one of the most progressive regulations again in the EU, the third energy package, that actually looks into this and says that you cannot be one corporation doing up, mid, and downstream at the same time, protecting the right of consumers, and trying to liberalize the market. And this is something that we could think about also with data. Could we somehow disintegrate the data flows? Could we say, Facebook, okay, you can accumulate the data, but then you can sell it? Something, we have to break the monopoly somewhere. This is the case of monopolization. And whether this is then going to consumers or how exactly it's going to be regulated, obviously we need experimentation with this. But I think we have certain models already in place. We just know that in general, big monopolies are not really a good thing, neither for economy nor for democracy. We just know it from history. And why would now new monopolies suddenly be anything different? It would be a good question to social scientists to ask, to compare, and to actually find, the boundary conditions, because obviously things are transferable, but the context always matters. So it's transferable to an extent, and actually testing out these boundaries, this is something that is a task for us, I think.
And I think the parallel to the oil and gas sectors is a good one. Of course, if you go back in history, we had there's this case of the breaking up of Standard Oil, and this, the attempt to try to prohibit and control these monopolies. And I think in the tech sector, we are just in the beginning of that conversation. But I like the fact that you point to possibilities there for using the mechanisms that we have in place to try to control that. But it seems to me still there's little, at least political will, to push these models onto the tech sector. I mean, despite GDPR and some of the backlash we've seen, I think in the political realm, it seems that still politicians kind of have this view that technology is uncontrollable in a way. And I think you had a very good point earlier about social scientists. An important role for us is to point to possibilities for change and point to hope. So maybe this is another area where it's important for us to try to come in and point to, or try to bring up these models and make suggestions for how they can be used to control these big companies. Are there any sort of concrete possibilities for that, the way you see it?
Well, let me first go a step back and go back to the research on environmental governance that I have been doing, because I always draw now parallels between the environmental or the natural environment and the digital environment. I don't even want to, get rid of the term environmental governance, because I think it's very much of environmental governance that we need instead of technology governance. And so what do we know about natural environmental governance? Well, one thing that I think is now very well established is that there is pretty much a consensus regarding the fact that nature is important and that we are very much dependent on the nature, that the biosphere carrying capacity is limited, and we need to find ways to live in harmony with nature. This is very interesting because doesn't matter where we look, this is actually not a contested issue. You know, when I was doing research on the Russian Arctic policy narratives, it has not been a contested issue there. Yes, on the one hand, Russia is maybe exploring new oil and gas fields, but it's constantly telling that nature is very important. And guess what? It's just now so much in our culture that we can't really say otherwise. And I think this is important. Some people say it's greenwashing, and I agree, there is a lot of greenwashing going on. But I think it's a great fact, it's actually great news that we have greenwashing in the first place, because it means that we all agree that this is a value and this is of utmost importance. And so the first thing would be, you know, to arrive at the same page to say, this is important. Right? So raising the profile of these issues, and this is what also the UN reports have been noticing. And this is the debate we were having in the 1980s, right? When environmental politics issues were low politics in comparison, you know, to security or some other. They were supposed to be high politics, you know, very actual and topical. No, also this is now high politics. And this is the first thing that we would need. And this is kind of a transferable lesson. The second thing that we know from environmental governance is, okay, when everyone agrees, but everyone has their own needs. And I actually think that speaking of needs gives us a bit better understanding and perspective than speaking of interests. Interest is kind of a very, number one, it's very realist-inspired concept. And number two, it's a very homo economicus inspired concept, because it basically means that we know what we want, and you know we're rational utility maximizers. But then obviously all the research that has been done around this on bounded rationality, on cognitive biases, it shows that we are not like this. And what is very important is we are motivated also by our needs. And when we look into some kind of, you know, environmental settings through the perspective of needs, we see a slightly different picture. So, for example, when I was looking into the cases with shipping or with renewable energy uptake, then you suddenly see, oh, in this community, there is actually a local administration, and they have only this budget, and they actually have a legal obligation to provide everyone with energy. And they don't have now the money to experiment with renewables. It's not that they are specifically evil and against renewable energy. They just also have their needs, and they need to somehow meet their needs, because otherwise they're out of their job. Then there are some other companies, and they also want to stay in business, right? So if we see that everyone just has their needs, and what I discovered, at least in the successful cases that I was studying, is that transformative change happens when needs of different parties are being met, at least to a certain extent. And this is where actually change happens. So if we start thinking that, well, everyone has their own needs, and how can we meet them? And stop seeing the world into, you know, these are the bad guys and these are the good guys. Because everyone just does what, you know, we are playing different roles in society. And business corporations also have their role to play there. And this is something we can also learn. So we need also to try to understand then, what do they want? And what do we want? And where do we all want to meet? And what are we ready to maybe leave off? And in terms of, let's say, shipping, one of the questions is obviously to us as consumers, are we ready to pay higher prices? Because greener shipping will mean that all consumer goods will be more expensive. If we want to participate in this, then okay, we can now give this money that we're paying extra for greener transport to the ship owners, who will then improve the let's say, CO2 performance of their ships. This is all possible, but it's a societal task, right? It's not only them, it's also us who have to be involved. And the third thing is, and this is what we already discussed today, is that context matters a lot. And a solution that works in one context will maybe not work in another context. The example that I was providing to you about the different pathways for renewable energy uptake, or another beautiful research that we have been doing on emissions in ports. And we just took 3 different regulatory areas and we asked, okay, so if regulation is different, the outcomes should be just different, right? Because here is this standard and here is this standard. But then it appeared that these regulatory frameworks are not the primary factor that determines the level of emissions. And now you guess, what is it? Actually, the specificities of how these ports were built, what kind of shipping sectors were in them. Because if you have, let's say, a lot of cruise ships, then they need to operate also while being at berth. So because they are working as hotels. And this is a huge difference to container ships or to an oil tanker where there are 7 people on board and when it's there, you just cut off the engine. Big differences. Also like industry-wise and location-wise. And I guess also start a bit differentiating the digital, because very often we equate digital to online, but obviously digital is much broader. We're also talking Internet of Things, we're talking robotics, we're talking artificial intelligence, a broad scope of applications, and just not putting everything into the same basket.
I want to change topic a little bit and to talk a bit about your approach to research and how you work. And one thing that has impressed me a lot with your approach to your work is you seem very problem-driven rather than sort of driven by having a set of methodologies you need to use. Rather, you know, there are certain things you want to figure out, and then you bring together the methodologies and questions and approaches that can help you shed light on this. So yeah, so you're quite interdisciplinary, problem-driven, and use mixed methods. Could you tell us a bit about sort of the challenges that you've faced working in this way, and why you sort of still persist to work with a variety of methods and this problem-driven approach to research?
Well, I don't see any challenges there. I see a lot of opportunities, but I see a lot of work, because obviously it just much more, it requires much more time and effort to learn different methods and to, at least in theory, understand how they work. Because when it comes to applications, and if you need some help, you will always find somebody who can help you with application, but you first need to understand how does it actually work. What do you need to get in? What are the limitations on using this method? And then what could potentially come out of it? And how should we interpret it, right? So the technicalities I leave aside, because this is not so important. Many people are afraid of technicalities. I think this is secondary importance. Important is really being sharp on what does this method actually do to your data. And I was maybe raised in a more qualitative tradition. As most or many social scientists and people inclined to humanities, I was very afraid of statistics and data and coding until I actually realized that I really need it. And this happened when I was doing my PhD, and this is where I realized that I somehow have a problem with understanding what to really look into. So I have, the methods of how I can go and do qualitative research, but I need to select cases. But how would I select cases? Because it felt to me always so arbitrary. Just people say, this is a critical case, and it just didn't feel right. So I decided to kind of turn the tables. I've read in some methodology books that some people do this, but I have not really seen it much being in application. And this is this kind of a mixed method research where you start with quantitative and then you go into the qualitative. Because very often it's the other way around, or mostly it's the other way around. People kind of qualitatively look into the field, maybe make a few interviews and say, well, this is what we are going to look into, and then they collect the data, the kind of the numerical, statistical data, and run some regressions. I actually started to work in a different direction, and my whole research is basically using this reversed mixed method methodology. I start with either quantitative or computational methods. So I take a large data set and I look into the patterns emerging out of it. So these types of analysis, like factor analysis or correspondence analysis, are something that I would use. Or then with more computational, let's say we take a big amount of texts and then we run methods from computational linguistics, trying to discover what are the patterns in this big amount of texts. And then once we spotted something interesting there, then we take our qualitative classes and then we go and we dwell and we go into the narratives and we meet people and interview. But this actually comes out of first seeing a broad variety and not just out of my intuition. I'm trying always to be very sharp on what do I choose as the cases for my study and why do I pick this or that narrative, or why do I pick this or that specific story in the field, because I try to start from a big amount and then narrow it down. So this is the first thing. And the second thing is just not being afraid of trying to experiment and just, be creative. So my latest work, this is a very interesting experience for me. I just got with my colleagues a paper published in the journal Atmospheric Environment. Yes, so it's a journal primarily publishing research in atmospheric physics. I'm not an atmospheric physicist, but my colleagues are. And together we have created this research. And basically we are experimenting with satellite imaging and how can we align data that comes from satellite imaging that we are then using, or my colleagues are using, to estimate air emissions, and then we take from the other side the social science data. We go and look into these localities, we use social statistics, and in the next steps we hope to actually go on the ground and make interviews, and we discover amazing things. I really want to tell you about this one, because we were looking in eastern Siberia, in Yakutia, at two oil extraction sites, not far from each other. And we discovered that one has a lot of associated petroleum gas flaring and another one very little. And now it's in the same country, it's in the same sub-part of this country, it's from the same industry. Why are they having different practices? So now this is really an interesting case to investigate. We use the satellites from the space in order to find this very peculiar pattern. And now we have looked, from afar. Now we can go close. This research is not yet done. This is the next step. But this is kind of, what interdisciplinarity and mixed method research can give you at best, because we would have never known that this exists.
I think that's fascinating, and I really appreciate this very problem-driven and pragmatic approach. I think the challenge that many are seeing is that when you are experiencing, and I'm happy that you say you're not experiencing this in the same way, is that when we get into a particular methodology or particular fieldwork, there's an academic community around it, which has certain norms, certain expectations, and then we have these struggles between these different communities. People, defend their own approaches, etc., and it makes it harder for people to take this kind of pragmatic and mixed approach. But I'm very appreciative of the way that you approach this, and I think it's happy that I'm happy that we are able to, through the Nils Klim Prize, sort of award this kind of research approach. But there's one final thing I'd like to end with, which has to do again with your approach to research. And I know that you've been on maternity leave for the past year or year and a half, taking a long break from research. So I wanted to ask you, sort of, how has this changed your perspective on work and on research to take this time off?
Yes, obviously I have been busy with other things during this time, but I guess there are two things. One is maybe it feels a bit banal, but it gives me a lot of also new motivation to do research specifically in the areas that I am investigating, because I feel like we owe something to the future generations, and the better we do our job, the better they will have it, or maybe the easier they will have it, and not just cleaning up our mess. So this is one strong part. And another one is that actually for the first time in my life, I managed to clean up my desk. It took a year to actually get everything that has been there. It has been all submitted, it came back, and then I resubmitted, and now I'm actually at a clean desk, which is wonderful for the first time in my life. And it feels like really truly a new beginning, and I had this wonderful time to just, pushing the stroller and thinking. Just thinking very freely outside of obligations to produce. And this brought a lot of somehow fresh perspectives, because I didn't have to concentrate or anything. I didn't have to now come up with a book manuscript or a set of articles. And I could talk to my friends about these issues. And this whole story about sustainability and digitalization, it has emerged and developed for me exactly through these just very unstructured thinking processes, and reading a bit there, and listening to a podcast there, and somehow then it just takes time in the brain for the pieces to come together, and you need to allow this time and just to breathe.
I totally agree, and I experienced the same thing. I think we have set a very high pace for ourselves in academia at the moment, where we're expected to produce a lot, and it seems to be, the expectations seem to be growing and growing and growing for higher productivity, and I'm not always sure that that's conducive to good work. I also think that some of the best papers that I have written are papers that I have been thinking about, or my colleagues and I have been discussing for longer periods of time, and that makes them better. So I also think that slowing down, slowing down thinking, and of course I know also from my own experience that being on paternity leave or maternity leave, it's not necessarily slowing down in all senses of the word. It's very, very hectic and busy. But it also gives a bit of space from the research that we're engaging with. And a space to reflect and step back, and in your case even to clean the desk. Maybe I should try that sometime as well. But with that, I want to thank you so much for this conversation. It's been fascinating to engage with you through this whole Nils Klim Award activities, and also today with this conversation that we've had. I really look forward to following your work and seeing where you take these important questions. So thank you so much, Daria Gritsenko, and congratulations again on the Nils Klim Award.
Thank you very much. It has been a great pleasure to converse with you.